I don't want no oil, a spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!
Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to those of you listening on the internet wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and I am your host for the next hour for this program, which we call For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment. We talk about them in terms of how they affect you, your family, your wealth, your health, your happiness. And unfortunately, my co-host, due to technical difficulties, Rebecca Wood, won't be on the show this day, except she might call in after the break. We can hope she might be able to get a line to us after 8:30, but we have a great show lined up for you. In any event, we have Darryl Stockburger, a returning guest, and he's going to be talking about the solar fields down here in Bowling Green and a project that they're doing that it's pretty interesting in ecological terms. So here I am once again broadcasting from my living room, and as you may know, every week I've been dressing up because, normally I come into the studio and, the fantastic facilities there, and sometimes, for example, I like to come in a little early, and there's in the gardens they have a hedge maze, so you can walk around and kind of contemplatively and turn corners and find, flower bushes or statues, and it's just this really cool experience, and it just makes you realize you're on your way to doing something really important when you're going to do your radio show. And since I can't do that anymore, the studios are still closed. They may open up soon here, I don't know. But I've been dressing up, and so this week the special thing is I have my Fantastic Four tie, which I got as a gift from my wife a number of years ago. Fantastic Four was my favorite comic book growing up. I bought all their comics, and they're the one in the whole Marvel Studios franchise that hasn't really been treated very well in terms of superhero movies. Oh, there's been a couple okay movies, but they haven't really tapped the full potential of the Fantastic Four. And I'm hoping a really good Fantastic Four movie comes out soon. But in the meantime, I have my tie and I have my comic book collection, so here I am in COVID isolation, and I'm all set. Another thing I have is my garden. Carol and I, my wife and I, went out and got most of our planting done already before Memorial Day. This is kind of a record for us. Usually we get our garden in, when we manage to get a garden in, we usually get it in somewhere just before the solstice in June. So it's very nice. We've got pole beans, we've got radishes, we've got arugula, and arugula is something I don't really know some people love arugula, and I'm kind of like, what is the big deal with arugula? But my wife is one of those people, so we've got it. And gardening is one of those points of intersection for people and nature. When you go out and actually get your hands dirty and you're digging up the ground, and you've got finding the grubs and the worms in your garden, and the birds are waiting for you to get done so that they can come down and eat the stuff that you've uncovered with digging up your garden. It's really nice to just be out in the sun working in your garden, and it was an example this year for us. It's another example of sort of the synergy that you get when you start trying to live for the green future, when you start trying to live a life that's balanced with the earth and with nature. And because one thing we're doing this year to a degree we've never done before, and so literally every morning I'm walking out to the compost bin, putting the scraps in there from the day before, and it's composting nicely. And when I say nicely, I mean compost piles, people have this image of this big, smelly, stinky pile of garbage. Well, that's not a good, healthy compost pile. The way you know if you have a healthy compost pile, in fact, is that it doesn't smell, that you can walk right up to it and it has practically no odor, and you could put your hand above it and you could feel that it's actually giving off heat. And so we've got a good, healthy compost going this year, and I'm going to be using that compost as mulch around all our garden plants. And so this is the year I have determined that I'm going to learn how to weed properly. In years past, I always have so much sympathy for the weeds, the lamb's quarters and the pigweed, because they're all edible, and they're actually, a lot of them are more nutritious than the plants we plant. For example, lamb's quarters is more nutritious than spinach. And so I have trouble just weeding them, just picking them and throwing them away. But I've determined this year I'm going to have like a picture perfect garden, one of those gardens that people look at and say, wow, instead of one of the garden that I usually have, which is roughly half plant that I've put there and half plant that planted itself. So we'll see how that goes. How's your garden this year? Are you doing it? Did COVID give you the time and the inspiration to actually get a garden in this year? Apparently there's a huge run on garden plants. I was over when we picked up our tomato plants. Actually, we went and there was almost nothing left, and they were charging, as I remember, they're charging almost triple what they charged last time I bought tomato plants. So apparently lots and lots of people are putting in gardens this year, which is great. One thing happened though on that trip that I did want to talk about, and that is, as we were walking up, two of the people who worked at the store were talking, and there was a woman and a man, and the woman was talking to the man about wearing masks, and I heard her say, oh yes, they're terrible, they'll hurt you because you're breathing your own CO2. And I was just devastated again, because this is a lie, folks. I've talked about this before on the show, and since I have this stage here, I'm going to mention it again. I wore an N95 mask almost 8 hours a day for over 10 years as a machinist in an industrial ceramics factory. And they don't kill you. You're much, much more likely to die from COVID than you are from breathing your own CO2 from a dust mask or from an N95 mask. But what's happening is that there's this disinformation going out. There's people who are actively promoting these false ideas about masks, and they have led to people hurting themselves by not covering up. And the ironic thing about these two people working at the store is they were both obviously late 60s, early 70s, people at highest risk from dying if they catch COVID. But somehow they got convinced by social media, by a meme, by something somebody else told them because they saw it somewhere, that they were spreading this falsehood about breathing your own CO2 being from wearing a mask is like deadly. And it's worth talking about this idea of falsity, and we're going to come back to that later on in the show, because we have to have some truth in numbers. And we are very sorely lacking truth in numbers. I don't know if you heard the story down from Florida. There was a woman there who was in charge of Florida's internet reporting on the COVID virus, and she got fired because she refused to falsify the numbers. She refused to downplay the number of people sick and dying from COVID in the state of Florida to justify reopening Florida before the virus is under control. And this kind of playing with the numbers, this kind of cheating, may be normal in politics, but when it comes to science, if you cheat in science, people die. If you cheat in public health issues, there's dire consequences in terms of the people getting sick and dying. And so this is why it's important to have some idea of science, for all of us to understand something about ecology and things like the spread of disease and so forth, because once you have that education, once you've learned about how things work in the real world, when someone makes a ridiculous claim, like the claim that even though Florida is opening up and even though people are crowding together on the beaches, their numbers of COVID cases are going down, you could look at that with some skepticism. You could say, wait, that doesn't make any sense. Nobody's wearing masks. Everybody's packing into the bars. Your numbers, no matter what you're reporting, are most likely going up. And being able to make that call is the opposite of what I saw at the store when I went to buy my tomato plants, where this woman just parroted what she had been told. And it's just important that we all develop that ability to think for ourselves. Sometimes the numbers aren't true. Sometimes you have to realize that there's truth, and then there's the numbers that are being reported to you, and you have to be able to ask the question, hey, are those numbers right? And if you can't ask that question, you're going to be led astray. You're going to take risks with your own health and your own wealth and your own happiness and your own family. But that's not to say that things aren't winnable. That's not to say that we can't improve. If we accept the truth of the numbers and we are able to recognize the true numbers, we're finding out more and more that we can fix things. Just like with my garden, once you start working towards having a good, clean garden, things just sort of fall into place and it gets easier and easier. The same thing is happening with the grid and with our electrical and our energy usage. I have a big story on that after the break, after the half hour. But right now, speaking of truth and numbers, I'd like to bring on my special guest, Darryl Stockburger. Are you with us?
Yes, and good morning.
Hey, Darryl. Hey, how are you?
Yeah. Oh, I'm doing fine. I was getting a little bit worried there. I could hear you fine, but wasn't getting through.
Yeah, well, you're here now, and glad to have you. And so you're a returning guest on For a Green Future. We're very happy to have had you on before, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future. But could you just remind our listeners, like, who you work for, what your job is, and so forth?
Sure. I work for the City of Bowling Green. I'm the Assistant Director of Utilities. In long distant past, I was once the Director of Utilities. And well over 20 years of experience with our Utilities Department.
Mm-hmm. And that's a number we can trust there. And yeah, you actually, when you were Director of Utilities, you helped bring Bowling Green's iconic wind turbines to the city, as I recall.
Yes, the wind turbines were one project. We also have a large share of hydropower, and also to date, the largest local renewable energy project we have is consisting of the solar field east of town. Total of 20 megawatts there.
20 megawatts of solar. That's great. And that's one reason I asked you on today, was to talk a little bit about something you're doing in conjunction with that solar project, you're doing wildflower planting. Is that correct?
That's correct. We have a pollinator project that we partnered with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other organizations. And we are currently in the second year of that establishment. It's expected to take about 3 years. The idea is to have a perennial field of habitat for pollinators. Has a number of advantages for us, and so far it's held true that we don't have to mow it near as much as grass. So that's in itself an environmental benefit. We do not have the proliferation of flowers yet that I had expected, but they tell me that the progression's normal. You see, the first year, we basically had to fight a field of ragweed. This year, the alfalfa, there are several varieties of alfalfas and clovers included, amongst various grasses and pollinator shrubs in the project. But the alfalfa seems to be the dominant plant right now. So expect that to give us a lot of blossoms here before long.
Mm-hmm. Well, plus alfalfa puts nitrogen in the soil and probably gets it ready for other flowers that are coming along in the succession.
Oh, absolutely. We see it as a way to return some of the agricultural benefit to the area, as well as improving the ecology. These pollinators tend to have deeper roots than grass, so they are great for the soil. Also, they are thick foliage, which helps slow down the runoff that we experience. And with all of the land being used heavily for agriculture, there's little enough habitat for pollinators, species of butterflies and all kinds of bees, honey and otherwise. And so we can see it as a more harmonious use of the solar facility.
One thing that some people have been saying, and I kind of got in a Facebook debate with a fellow about this, they're saying that the things like the solar projects and the wind projects take up so much land, take up so much room that we would have to deforest the nation in order to have enough solar panels to provide all the power we need. But I don't think by the numbers, I don't think that's true. One thing that we did, we were interveners when Davis-Besse had its relicensing, and we had a professor emeritus from University of Toledo, Al Campan, and he basically did some calculations that showed all you would need to do is cover parking lots the way they have at Owens Corning and the way they have at the Toledo Museum of Art, parking lots and rooftops, and you could have more than enough solar power to replace the output of the nuclear plants, or to basically make up any kind of shortfall that would be gotten from closing any kind of power plant in the state of Ohio. Does that jive with your experience working with solar fields?
Yeah, we actually see an increase in efficiency in solar technologies. We get a lot more energy, for example, from the solar panels than we would, say, conversion to ethanol of a crop, because every month year-round you get at least some energy from the solar panels, granted a lot more in the summer than the winter. The technological barrier is not that we don't have enough sun to supply everything. We just don't have sun 24/7 down here on Earth. And so the storage of it is a barrier. It's also what makes it quite compatible with, say, the wind technology, which tends to put out more energy in the winter and in many areas of the country at night than the solar. And so they're quite compatible as far as progressing toward more renewable energy. In fact, I'm kind of proud of the country right now. if you include the existing hydro, the renewable energy has now approached 20% on a national basis, which is basically equivalent to the amount of energy we get from our nation's nuclear fleet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And actually, during COVID, because a third of the nuclear fleet shuts down every spring for refueling, wind and sun together actually outperformed nuclear or coal. It didn't outperform nuclear and coal, but it actually put more power in the grid than either nuclear or coal during these past couple months here, which is amazing. Because I remember it was not long. I remember it was not long ago that people were saying that it would be impossible for the grid to have that high a percentage of wind and solar power.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And I think the thing that made the big difference is the switching of fuel from coal to natural gas. Gas turbines can respond much more quickly than the base-loaded coal or nuclear plants to changes in load or matching output. And so there is a lot more renewable energy working harmoniously with the grid than what I would have seen as possible just 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So how would you rate the overall success so far of Bowling Green's solar field project? Is it doing what it was expected? How's it doing?
Yeah, it is meeting expectations and projections pretty much right on the money. Solar, of course, is a bit more predictable than the wind on an annual basis, but we're very pleased. Currently, we get about 4% of our energy needs from our share of the solar field. And in terms of peak, often as much as 13% of our peak electric demand comes from Bowling Green's share of the solar field.
Wow, that would be a tremendous savings in cost, because the peak electricity is what really hits you in the wallet there.
Sure, and you can imagine. It sounds like a lot of land, but you can imagine just how much land there is around Bowling Green, and it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination with the advent of storage, to see that being able to increase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were, when I had you on the last time, we were talking a little bit about storage and the battery technology advancing. Are you still looking at that? Is that still something potentially in the future?
And in fact, we have an active examination of a storage project to be placed where we at one time had diesel generators to go on the pads that are available after those had been removed due to age. It's probable, though, and we've already seen some delay. COVID coming along, of course, had a double whammy. It reduced load, so the need for the storage is somewhat lessened. Also, just doing construction has been delayed out of the many shutdowns and slowdowns that have occurred.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's still coming, but life's at least mildly on hold for almost everything.
Yeah, it is. But we will get through this somehow eventually. But I was wondering, I don't know if you can answer this question or not, but the European countries are reporting that with the reduction in traffic, with the reduction in air pollution from cars, they found that their solar fields are actually producing more power because there's less pollution. It's as a measurable effect. Have you noticed that in BG, or is that
not per se. I think a lot depends on local climate.
Mm-hmm.
In our case, we have a lot of cloudy days, with or without the automobile traffic, just due to our proximity, for example, to Lake Erie And so I don't see or expect to see a huge difference.
Right.
But then the year's not over.
Just wanted to talk a little bit, just briefly, about the whole idea of mitigation for wind and solar. I mean, it sounds like this wildflower planting could be considered a form of mitigation in that you're replacing farm fields, but you're replacing it with something that benefits pollinators and allows groundwater to get recharged from the fields and so forth. That's a pretty big industry right now, and it looks pretty promising for the future. Could you talk a little bit about mitigation?
Well, yeah, we have talked quite a bit about mitigation for the solar, and of course on the wind turbine side, there has been a lot of work done to make them more capable of coexisting with particularly large birds of prey. The better answer to me is to look at technologies that, for example, can sense birds coming near the turbines, and also looking at methodologies to discourage them from coming close to the turbines, as opposed to just shutting them down. They have become too important to a reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in my opinion, to just shut them down. At nighttime, there are very few other renewable energy options to replace the power from the wind. And so what, especially here in Ohio, what happens when you shut them down is you utilize more fossil fuels.
Right. Then we got to stop doing that. All right. Well, Darryl, pleasure as always talking with you. And so if people wanted to see the BG turbines, they could just come down off Route 6 there near the dump and the county dump, Wood County dump, and take a look at them. And it's just, very encouraging to see projects like this succeed and taking us that little bit closer to the green future.
Well, thank you. And we're very proud that Bowling Green currently gets 40% of its energy needs. That's all of the industries, the shops, the stores, the residentials. 40% of their energy, a pretty good milestone on our way to doing better.
Yeah. Let's get to that 100%. And but yeah, 40. It's a good start. All right. Well, Darryl Stockburger, thanks so much for joining us again on For a Green Future.
And thank you for inviting me. Take care.
Okay, so that was Darryl. Did anything he say kind of pique your interest there, or did you have any other question on any sort of environmental issue that you've seen in the news or that you're curious about? Give us a call at 866-240-1065 anytime during this next half hour or so that we've got of the program. Hopefully we're going to get a call for Rebecca pretty soon here, but we'll see. Right now it is time to acknowledge our sponsors, our wonderful, wonderful sponsors. For a Green Future is brought to you by the Wood County Park District. Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats, and they lead outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy, and they're open from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. There are several ways to get in touch with them. If you want to find out more about what they're doing, you can call them at 419-353-1897, or you can go to their website at wcparks.org, and they have a nifty app, which is just go to the App Store and download WC Parks. And they also, this is now switching from advertising to public service announcement, which if you have any sort of environmental event or news, you can send it to Joe at Joe DeMare for a Green Future, and we will most likely read it for you on the air. But the Wood County Parks is having a scavenger hunt, which is going through tomorrow, and that's the last day of it. But it looks like it's going to be a beautiful day out here in Wood County today. So what you want to do if you're interested in joining this scavenger hunt is first go to the Wood County Parks Facebook page, and there's a virtual clue there. And that virtual clue will lead you to another virtual clue, and then the second virtual clue will lead you out into the parks. And then you're going to race around the parks, and it will eventually take you to a prize where you could win bamboo cutlery, a set of bamboo cutlery, which is perfect for taking out on picnics all through the summer. So check out the Wood County Parks Nature Quest scavenger hunt going on right now. And something else that's going on right now, even though you can't see it, it's supporting this show, is the patronage of our patrons on Patreon. And we're very grateful for the people that have signed up on Patreon. They just went to patreon.com and they searched for a Green Future, and there's a nice little page there talking about our show with different levels of membership. And at those different levels, you can sign up and just make a small monthly donation to the program and help keep us on the air. So we are extremely grateful to our patrons on Patreon. Okay, well, this is the time of the show where I really appreciate it when Becca's around, because believe it or not, it's not that easy to talk for an hour straight. I know some people do it. I feel it's a lot easier when you have a co-host, co-pilot along, and so missing her right now. But there's some news that I wanted to bring up. This is the point of the show where we talk about news and information. And one thing I wanted to talk about, there's big news out of the Pacific Corp, which is the electrical generation and supply company over there in like Washington State. It's on the West Coast. And they just made a historic, sort of a groundbreaking purchase of electric power. And the reason this is groundbreaking is that they have just contracted for 1,823 megawatts of solar power, 600 megawatts of battery storage, and 1,920 megawatts of wind to supply their customers. So just to put this in context, the solar, that's more than 2 Davis-Bessie's worth of power of solar, and going on 3 Davis-Bessie's worth of power for wind. They are supplying power without any natural gas backup. That's Darryl Stockburger was mentioning how right here in Ohio and in most of the country, if they have wind and solar during the periods where there's neither wind or solar, natural gas is making up the difference. Well, they have figured out that with the 600 megawatts of battery storage, and that's a bank of batteries that's roughly 2/3 the energy of Davis-Bessie nuclear power plant, that they don't even need the gas backup. And so this is all going to be installed and operational by 2023. And this is one great aspect of wind power and solar power that nuclear power, for example, cannot hope to match, and that is the speed at which you can install these things. Wind turbine project, a utility scale wind turbine, from breaking ground to flipping the switch and putting the electricity onto the grid, that could take less than a month. And solar projects can go up at similar speeds. Solar projects take a little longer, they're a little more complicated, but they don't take anywhere near nuclear plants. And we know this because the only 2 nuclear plants under construction right now are the Vogtle plants, and they are approximately 10 years over schedule, behind schedule. They are something like 300% over budget. They've taken much more to build, more expensive than was predicted. Started back in the Obama days. This was Obama's love child here. This was his pay back to the nuclear industry, because when he was running for president, his largest contributor was Exelon, which is a nuclear power plant operator. And so he pushed these plants through, and they have turned out to be, so far, incredibly expensive boondoggles. They've spent billions and billions and billions on them. They're decades behind schedule. Now, if they had spent that same money on wind and solar, those plants would have been running for the past decade. That's millions of tons of CO2 that would have been avoided, both in the construction and in the generation that has been picking up the slack that these plants were supposed to have been generating. And so it just shows again, and you heard Darryl say that Bowling Green's plant has been right on the money in terms of how long it took to put them up, how much power they were expected to generate. All that stuff has been predictable and on the money. And these nuke plants, the Vogtle nuke plants, are still, they continually push the deadline for starting back. They were supposed to start right about now, but now they're pushing them back. It looks like into next year. I personally hope they never get operational. I hope they never flick that switch, because, and frankly, if they stopped right now, if they stopped building the nuke plants right now and started using the same money that they're spending right now, they could have wind and solar plants up on the same site, and they could be generating comparable amounts of power by the end of the year, by the end of this year. You could just start from scratch, put up wind turbines and solar panels, and you could be generating power by the end of this year without generating any nuclear waste. And it's just crazy that we're still pushing that form of power. But we've talked about it before. And one interesting note about this project, it's going to be supplying power at an incredibly cheap rate. And in fact, Pacific Corp has crunched the numbers, and last October they were saying by 2038 we're going to have 7 gigawatts. Actually, they've increased that, because now they're saying by 2038 they're going to have 13.7 gigawatts of just wind, solar, and battery storage. And they're discovering that it's cheaper to build new wind and solar and battery than it is to continue running existing coal plants, which is just incredible. I mean, to take a plant which is already built, and you don't have to invest anything more in the structure, the infrastructure of it, it's still cheaper to build brand new wind and solar than to continue running those coal plants. And so they're going to be shutting their coal plants down, switching to wind, sun, and storage, just like we could be doing if the power executives in our regional power authorities, like Energy Harbor, had any sense. And I don't give them any slack, because we told them all this back during the Davis-Besse relicensing hearings. We laid this out for them with experts, with dollar signs, with numbers, and we told them, again, truth in numbers. We showed them they could actually make more profit by abandoning Davis-Besse and putting up wind and solar, and they ignored us, and the rest is sad, sad history. Now, there is there's sort of a sad unintended consequence of closing all the coal plants. And, this is something that we do need to take into account. We can't just gloss over it. And that is that our nation's railroads are very dependent on coal for profitability, on shipping coal. And so if we just shut down the coal industry, it's going to cause something of a crisis for our railroad industry. And, I read a book a few years back by John McPhee, and it was called Uncommon Carriers. And John McPhee's a great author. He's written things like The Deltoid Pumpkin Seed, which is about a proposed dirigible that could carry tons of freight and with using hydrogen power and save tons of energy and be much more efficient than current airliners. He also his first book that sort of made him famous was called The Curve of Binding Energy, which is a very interesting book. It tells you how to make a nuclear bomb. And I have it. It's very difficult to get copies of it these days, as you may guess. But it's amazing how easy it looks like to make a nuclear bomb. And all he did was use publicly available information, and then he sort of ran what he came up with past actual atomic bomb scientists, and they were kind of like, oh, that actually might work. It's an interesting book, and he's a great author, John McPhee. But one thing he wrote about in that were the railroads and the carriers of coal being kind of what has saved the railroad industry for the past 20 years or so. But what we need to do then, rather than lose the railroad industry, is switch the railroads from carrying coal over to carrying us. We should be the main cargo on these rail cars going between the large cities, rather than reopening the airlines, which are terribly, terribly inefficient and which put enormous amounts of carbon in the air. A rail is much more efficient than cars, than trucks, and we should need to switch pretty much all our people moving and all our freight moving over to rail as much as possible, rather than continue to use these nasty internal combustion engines. Okay, so that was one piece of news. I just wanted to mention also that what is happening with Pacific Corp kind of touches on a controversy in sort of environmental circles, eco-people circles, and that is a lot of people are advocating for microgrids versus the grid. I mean, right now, the grid supplies pretty much everybody in the country with power, and the way the grid works is wherever your power plant is, it puts in, and wherever a user is, they take out. And somehow, over the whole nation, the balance between users and suppliers is maintained, so that there's never a huge oversupply, and there's very, very seldom brownouts or blackouts, because they can predict how this is going to go. People who are advocating microgrids say, oh, they're cleaner. Like I can have a microgrid at my university, and we're solar powered, and we're off the grid, and that way we're not part of that whole nasty grid with its coal power and its nuke plants. The thing is that the grid itself is one of the most amazing things humans have ever devised. What do you think about it? The amount of energy available at our fingertips because the grid is there is unparalleled in human history. Now, we waste a lot of that energy. We use it on frivolous things that we don't really need, but the idea of the grid is superior to the idea of microgrids, because with microgrids you need a lot more backup power because you've got all these isolated users and generators, and they need to be balanced. They need to balance themselves out, and that's much more difficult than having everybody on the system and being able to distribute the power all over the grid. I mean, the grid is kept energized by all its users. I mean, our grid is being partially energized by, let's say, the Niagara Falls power project. In terms of physics, you can't say, oh, this electron came from Niagara Falls that's going into my light bulb here. It doesn't work that way. The whole grid is kept energized constantly, and that provides strength. That means that if any one generator goes down, there's lots of other generators to pick up slack. And in terms of green energy, it means that if the wind is blowing in New York and not in Ohio, the power generated in New York could get shipped over to Ohio, and vice versa. And also, if the sun is shining in one place and not another, the sun from the Midwest can power the West as they're getting up and getting ready to get going. We need a nationwide grid. We need to maintain that nationwide grid. And as we've had guests on before, like Al Campan, the efficiency of the grid can be vastly improved by doing things like switching over to million-volt DC lines instead of maintaining this AC current, which takes a lot more energy to cover the longer distance. Remember, grid's good. Microgrids are okay in that maybe you want a municipality to be able to keep its power going if the main grid goes down, but everybody needs to stay connected so that we can all share the power that we're generating, and all the generators can support all the users. So that gives us the most stable, most flexible energy system. So don't buy into just everybody having their own little microgrid, because that's not going to work long term. All right. Another piece of news. This is a semi-political piece of news, but because it involves the Green Party, I'm going to mention it on my show, and that is that the Green Party is filing a lawsuit. Let me disclaimer first. I'm the political director of the Ohio Green Party, although right now and on my show I don't speak for the Ohio Green Party. I'm speaking only for myself. But as will you if you call in at 866-240-1065. We do have some time for a couple calls. So anyway, the Green Party is going to be filing suit with the Secretary of State because the COVID restrictions prevented the party from collecting petition signatures it needed to put a presidential candidate on the ballot. And so they're asking for relief from the courts to basically say, look, you were physically denied the ability to go door-to-door collecting. And actually, it's still unsafe to go because cases are ticking up again now that Ohio's opened up again. And so the Ohio Green Party's looking to get on the ballot through a lawsuit. And similar lawsuits have succeeded in other states around the country. So you may see a green on the presidential ballot in November. So we got to wait and see what happens with that. All right, now I think it's time to read our letter from the future. As you know, my great-great-granddaughter, Marie I., has been writing me from the year 2300. Here's this week's letter. Dear great-great-grandpa, well, I'm on the train on the last leg of the trip home to Bowling Green, Ohio. Sam and I are sharing a sleeper car. It's kind of funny. Ever since we were kids, he's always insisted on the top bunk. I'm still a little too weak to climb up there anyways. He's up there snoring away. I'm not able to sleep, so I'm sitting here watching the lake go by and mourning the loss of my child. As a mother, I pray that he is the last child to die from your time's terrible experiment with nuclear fission, but as a scientist, I know that there's still radionuclides from your atomic bomb tests and nuclear accidents in the Earth's land, sea, and water. It'll take hundreds of thousands of years for it all to go away. Still, as I'm watching the crescent moon putting sparkles on the tips of the water waves in Lake Erie, I feel comforted. Our silent, solar-powered train is zipping along. I can see thousands of stars in the Milky Way, where I could only have seen the haze of light pollution in your day. Why did you feel the need to light everything up all the time? Were you all like little children, scared of the dark? I am scared for Michael. He hasn't come out of his coma yet. Having lost the baby, the thought of losing Michael, too, makes me start to cry. Oh well, there's still hope. We won't know how much of Michael is left until or when he comes out of his coma. Until then, I will think of him as I've always known him, brilliant, introverted, and desperately in love with me. That's all for now, GGG. Suddenly, I feel like I can sleep through the rest of the night. Have a good night, Marie I. So, that's my letter from the future. Not a bad one. And if you have questions about the future, if you're wondering things about what it's like in the year 2300, you can send an email to me at joe@joedemare4agreenfuture.org, and I will be happy to pass your question on to Marie I, and she can write back and tell us what's going on there in the future. She has a trunk full of letters that I've written her with dates on them, and she's opening them one by one. So that's how I could communicate with her. And the way she sends letters back in time to me, well, she's not telling me how she does that. All I know is that every morning there's a flash of photons next to my bed, and there's the letter for Marie I. She's very punctual. Okay, well, we have just a few minutes left. Time for one call. And I would like to say that I am very appreciative to all of you for listening, and I'm appreciative to the other hosts on the station here on 106.5 The Ticket for giving us shout-outs, and I'd like to give a shout-out to Black and White Sports there and thank them for mentioning us on their show. And I have another note, one last thing I wanted to talk about. I do have an interesting piece of news from the Yale Climate Project, Yale University's project on the climate. They're always doing polling, and their latest poll, they have found that 73% of Americans are positive, yes, there is global warming. And interestingly, the number that are just as sure that there's no global warming has dropped down, and they are only at 10%. So 73% of us are, we realize, we admit, we can see, we can accept the evidence of our own senses, plus the words of the scientists. Yes, there's global warming. 10% have their eyes over their hands over their eyes and earplugs in, and they don't cover their mouth though. It's just the eyes and the ears. The 10% are saying no, there's no global warming. That leaves 17% that are in the baby column. But I think that this, going back to the theme of the truth being there in the numbers like this reaffirm my faith in democracy. Because democratically speaking, if there were a vote today and we were somehow being asked to vote on should we respond to global warming or not, that vote would pass with an overwhelming majority, 73%. I mean, there's always going to be people taking the contrary view. That's human nature. Some small percentage of us are going to be opposing things, even if they're the absolute truth. That's just, humans are stubborn that way. But to put that minority in charge of the government, which is the situation right now, because all the policies being put into place by Trump, by the Republicans, all those policies support the view of the 10% and not the view of the 73%. Or, if you toss in the maybes too, then we're up to 90% that understand it is a problem and that we should be trying to fix it, not make it worse. And just one example of that, and one little joke I wanted to make this week was you probably heard about President Trump firing the inspector generals at so many of our country's federal agencies. And the inspector generals are the ones whose specific job it is to prevent and to find and to root out corruption in their agencies. And so Trump's been firing them left and right. And I wanted to say that it's clear that when Trump said he was going to drain the swamp, all right, he wasn't, some of us thought he was talking about corruption in government. But if you want to prevent corruption in government, you don't fire the independent investigators in the agencies that you want to govern. You give them more power. You make them more involved in the agency's activities. That's how you get rid of corruption. No, what Trump meant when he said he wanted to drain the swamp is he literally wants to get rid of our wetlands. He wants to literally drain swamps, pave them over with concrete, and get rid of all those pesky animals and plants and stuff and fish that depend on them, because he doesn't like animals very much. So, all right. Well, I see that we are at 8:59. I am expecting any moment to hear our theme music come on. If you didn't call in this week, write down your question and call in with it next week, because we will be back and we love hearing from you. And with any luck, Rebecca will be on the air with me again next week. But it's been a pleasure, and it's always a joy to talk on Sunday mornings here on WTOD. This is Joe DeMare signing off.
I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit